So to anyone who's ever been at any of the old TED conferences, I am the dinosaur fucker. And I will never, ever live that down. I wish I had the talk now, because it's the only thing I possibly have that could stand up to the things that we've just had. But I don't. I have something quite different. So what I do for a living these days is I invent things. And I have a company that tries to invent new stuff. We get people together, often from different fields. That's particularly true when we work in medicine, because I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a physicist. Usually the only time a physicist and a brain surgeon are together, the physicist is getting cut open. It's not a happy thing. But we actually bring physicists and brain surgeons and computer scientists and all kinds of wacky people, including Danny sometimes, together to try to solve some problems. So I'm going to talk about a number of interesting big problems, and then some of the ideas we have that are trying to address them. Now, they're ideas. Some of them are going to be good ideas, some of them are going to be bad ideas. When you set out to invent, you can't have this failure is not an option. Failure better be an option, or you're not thinking broadly enough about the things that might work. And so what I'm going to tell you about is not the only solution or the best solution, but an interesting solution. So 1.7 million infections acquired in hospitals. I think they're called nosocomial infections. They're terrible. They kill 99,000 people a year. That's 4 times what traffic accidents kill. That's about 3 times what breast cancer kills. So it's a bad thing. So we were thinking, how could you do something about this? And we came up with an idea. And the idea is self-disinfecting surfaces. What if every surface that you had in a hospital would self-disinfect? Well, how do you make something self-disinfect? Well, if you've ever been to a Mexican restaurant that has one of these menus, you know that when they turn the menu on, it lights up. The rest of it doesn't light up. Only the ink fluoresces where it's in contact with the plastic. This is because of something called total internal reflectance. Similar thing happens inside fiber optics. So here's a sample, one of our panels. We run ultraviolet light through it. It doesn't emit out into the room, but here we're putting on something which fluoresces with ultraviolet, and in fact, it glows. So only things directly in contact with the surface are zapped with the ultraviolet light. So that means you can self-disinfect the surface without giving a suntan to everyone in the room. So the next question is, well, does that actually kill bacteria? By God, it does. Here's Staph aureus, and here's Staph aureus after 60 seconds of exposure. And we've done this for tons of different bugs. Kind of cool to grow all this nasty shit in the lab. But it's even more cool when, in fact, you can kill it. So where could you put this? Well, once you get into it, you think, well, damn, you can put this anywhere. We actually thought about it first on scalpels, but in fact, on touch screens, on bed rails, on doorknobs is probably the most useful thing you could put it on, to be honest. Anything that you could put a glass coating or actually it's not glass, it's a special glass, or use quartz or something else that the UV light will go through. So that's one idea. My favorite one is the endoscope. You don't want to think about where your endoscope has been before it met you. So the idea is continually self-cleaning. It's a good thing. Okay, in US hospitals alone, there are a whole bunch of nasty things. Bed sores, 382,000 pressure ulcers, 430,000 foot ulcers, 1.1 million leg ulcers. A lot of these are to people who have diabetes, and diabetes is an enormously growing problem, so these numbers are only going to go way up. It's a big problem any way you measure it. It's $20 to $25 billion, and I got to say, it's not a lot of fun. Those are terrible infections, and it's very difficult to treat these sort of chronic open sores. Now, there's a few things that you could imagine doing. One of the things is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide has got a variety of properties that are very helpful in this kind of healing, but it's very hard to apply it. Except, there's these compounds that release nitric oxide when light hits them. So we can do something a little bit like the first idea, and we say, well, why don't we make glow-in-the-dark bandages? So this is a bandage that is photoactivated. You get to put the nitric oxide salve on, then you only direct the light where you want it to go, and it can glow. And it can glow for as long as you want. You can do a whole variety of things. So it's another idea. Now, each of these ideas, we come up with it in these invention sessions. And some of the ideas don't make it, the really, really lame ones, of course I'm not going to tell you today, but there's a lot of those. These are some of the more promising ones, but even these, many of them will discover along the line that there's something that doesn't work. The key thing is you have to try an awful lot so that you get some out the other end. And one of the reasons I try to be very pro-invention and talk invention up is the more bad inventions we make, the more good ones we make. And if you're afraid of doing that, you're not going to innovate anywhere near as fast. Okay, next idea, X-rays. Now, X-rays are wonderful, but almost all of the energy in X-rays is wasted, 99.9%. Actually, I could carry the nines out, but it screwed up the formatting of the slide. So you have a problem. You'd like to use more of that energy because you've subjected yourself to some risks from that. If you're doing it all the time, you particularly have risks. You'd like to have a better way to do it. So the idea is something called backscatter imaging. It turns out when you throw X-rays at something, some of them scatter back. In fact, if you throw really weak X-rays, they don't make it all the way through. In an ordinary X-ray machine, that's bad, because it's only the ones that go all the way through that count. But in fact, you can get an awful lot of information out of the ones that bounce off. In fact, they're better in a whole lot of ways. So here's a prototypical hunk of tissue. And the ordinary X-ray it goes all the way through. The things that are absorbed by you, that's the part that's going to hurt you. That's the parts of the X-ray that don't give you much information. I mean, but it's only in the contrast of the ratio of how many go through or not that you see something. So when this occurs, you are backscattering all kinds of X-rays off. It turns out X-rays love to scatter off certain molecules. This is where being a physicist is an interesting thing in the room. In particular, there's something called K edges, which occur in the outer electron shells of calcium and iron, among other things. So the two things you could really spot if you used this is you could spot calcium and iron. Well, calcium and iron are both really interesting things to spot. So the basic idea of the system is you say, well, instead of doing it the conventional way, we're going to put something up to catch all of those backscattered X-rays. So when they come back down, we're going to catch them, and that's going to give us tons more information, including we can use X-rays so weak they would never penetrate. In fact, one of the original ideas was that we could do what we call look-ahead X-ray, where you only look an inch or so deep into the skin, but you can, the power is so low that you can have it right in a surgical field, and so a surgeon can figure out if in fact you're about to either go near a bone, which is important because there's nerves near bones, or you're about to hit a blood vessel which is full of iron because it's got the hemoglobin in it. So here's one of the things you use X-rays for. This is a mammogram. In a mammogram, you're looking for tiny calcium nodules. The calcium nodules tend to be associated with cancer. Tend to be is why you have a biopsy afterwards. Sometimes the cancer doesn't produce the calcium. Other times you get calcium without. But it's really hard to see the calcium. But calcium fluoresces in the X-ray spectrum. So in fact, this is a simulated image. Calcium is enormously more visible. So it's another idea. This was the look-ahead idea. In fact, during a surgery, can you actually be looking ahead and have constant X-ray goggles on to be able to see what's just a little bit ahead of where you're working? That can be an enormously important thing, but conventional X-ray doesn't work because it goes all the way through, and so it's very hard to tell where something is. It's also too strong for the patient and probably too strong for the doctor. You also can make CAT scans better. This unfortunate person has polycystic kidney disease. CAT scans, you're putting X-rays through your body from all angles. And because it goes through all possible angles, you can reconstruct what happens inside. But again, you're bouncing enormous numbers of X-rays off in backscatter. You're not collecting them. You get a much better image. So the interesting thing there is you have to make an interesting detector, and we have an idea for the detector. So here's something entirely different. This is pandemic flu. So we have a big program where we have disease simulations, and here we can see a pandemic flu. This is using the same parameters you'd have in the 1918 flu, but with modern world. And so in our simulation system, we have the air transport network, we know where all the airports are, we have all of the flight schedules, and so you model what happens to an epidemic in this modern world. It's not a very nice thing, actually. We have big models like this, not just for flu. We also have them for malaria. In fact, we have a huge anti-malaria set of programs. Also HIV and polio. Because if you have enormously detailed computer models, you get to practice eliminating the diseases there before you have to try to do it in real life. So, but now for something completely different. So we've looked at a couple of really serious problems. Now I'm going to look at the other way I spend my time, which is I've been writing a big cookbook. Seriously. It's called Modernist Cuisine, the Art and Science of Cooking. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my big, crazy cookbook. It's an encyclopedic treatment of modern cooking. There are 6 volumes, 5 big hardcover volumes, and then 1 volume that is spiral bound on waterproof paper, so you can take it in the kitchen. There are 2,400 pages in this book, 3,500 photographs, and it weighs 43 pounds, 48 pounds in the case. My favorite statistic, 4 pounds of ink. Isn't that amazing? Now, given that I'm kind of a digital guy, lots of people say, why on earth ink? Why paper? Why are you making a book? And the fact is, if you want to deliver large, high-resolution, beautiful photographs, paper is actually an excellent way to do it. You know, iPads are great. iPads just came out. We had to pick our platform 2 years ago for this. At that point, there was no iPad. But iPads are also little. And all the reasons that make people say, oh, this should be an ebook, all those same reasons mean there's never been a better time to make a physical book. Because the tools, the digital photography tools are fantastic. The publishing tools are fantastic. We have this great printer in China. They're super quick. They make beautiful work. We exchange digital files over the net. It's never been easier to make a paper book. It's also never been easier to sell a paper book. One of the reasons I'm doing this is I can actually sell it online. I'm publishing it myself. Nobody else is crazy enough to support it. So I'm going to walk you through the book a little bit. The first volume is called History and Fundamentals. It's about history and science and so forth. One of the themes of the book is we've got a lot of science. But we also wanted to make it very accessible, so we have a lot of cool photos. Sometimes gratuitously cool photos, like the strawberries. This is our microbiology chapter. We are the only cookbook with a chapter called Microbiology for Cooks. So one of the reasons you'd wear gloves when you touch that pig lung is this thing here. I took this picture. This is a trichinella worm encysted in a mussel. So that's what they look like. It kind of looks like the Hubble Space Telescope, but in fact, this is a worm. And it's why your mother told you to overcook the pork. Turns out you don't actually have to overcook the pork as much as Mom thought. But big chapter on microbiology. We have a big chapter on food safety, because food safety is an issue that it comes up a lot with any kind of modern food, whether it's E. coli outbreaks or salmonella or any of the other things. Food safety is a huge topic. And it was interesting because we discovered that most of the things people are taught about food safety are wrong. They're flat wrong. In fact, I found 5 errors in the FDA food code. I went to Washington, D.C., I met with them. Turns out they're not so keen when you point out errors. But the good news is I don't have a restaurant that their health inspectors can shut down, so I was able to do that. Here's one of the cooler things we did in the food safety chapter. There's a cream that you put on your hands. It's invisible. Then you tell people, wash your hands really clean. As if like maybe they'd just gone to the bathroom. And then you put on the UV light and you see all the places they missed. It is ridiculously simple to clean your hands, yet it is ridiculously important, and almost no one does it right. The single biggest thing you can do for food safety or any kind of hygiene, frankly, is washing your hands super well. We have a chapter on food and health. Part of the reason for this is that this book is about modern cuisine, so we use lots of very modern ingredients. We cook with liquid nitrogen and all kinds of gels and things. I'll talk about that in a minute. And people give me grief about that. They say, well, isn't that stuff chemicals? Isn't it chock full of chemicals? I said, yes, and those chemicals, they're chock full of elements. And it turns out that most of these so-called modern ingredients are actually very old. One of these modern ingredients is something called agar, which is 1,000 years old in Asia. It's only modern in cooking here. It's also used in science, interestingly enough, to culture bacteria. And that is because one of the technicians in the laboratory of a guy named Koch, who is one of the great microbiologists, was a woman whose next door neighbor used to live in Indonesia, and they said, oh, they passed a recipe along, and the recipe actually led to using it in science. So there's food and health. Here's heat and energy. It's really important cooking is about infusing heat into food in many cases, and yet most cooks have not been told even the first thing about how heat diffuses in stuff. So suppose you've got 2 steaks. One is 1 inch thick, one is 2 inches thick. How much longer would it take to cook the 2-inch thick steak than the 1-inch thick steak? Anybody? Not you, Martha. What?
4 times.
4 times, yes, 4 times. It goes as the square of the thickness. And that's a simple rule. It's very simple to figure out, but in fact, I don't think it's ever been in a cookbook before. Water. It turns out water is an incredibly important thing for cooking. Most food is water. There is more water in a cucumber than there is in a glass of milk. Cucumbers are 95% water. Milk, you got some fat, you got some protein. So it's in fact much higher. And the way water acts is incredibly important to cooking. It takes huge amounts of energy to boil water in particular. And that's an incredible fact that you use in steaming and cooking and so forth. Now, one of the things we really wanted to do is use photography to show people food in a way that they had not seen it before. And we did a couple of things to do it. One is we love macro photography. So this is blueberries. And those little orange things, those are the seeds inside blueberries. You usually don't see them. So whether it was using things like this, or here's our ultimate hamburger recipe. It's tough to repeal gravity, but in fact, if you do, you can make hamburgers like this. By using photography to show people food in a different way, we wanted to get them involved in the topic. Here was another one of our ideas. This is called the cutaway. And the idea of cutaways is that you could slice through something and see like a magic view to understand what's going on inside. So here we have broccoli in a little steamer inside a pot, and we want to see all of what's going on. Here is our pressure cooker cutaway. Not only do we see the pressure cooker, but we cut the jars open too. So whenever I show these, people say, oh God, that's really cool what you can do with Photoshop. And it turns out that you don't actually do it with Photoshop. Here's our Weber barbecue. This is how you make your hamburgers. And the various pieces of text explain all of the phenomena that's going on. Actually, quite a bit is going on in your barbecue. And each of those things in the barbecue are lending some aspect to what the final product is. So it's important to know. So how do we get those pictures? We have a machine shop. And we have, in particular, this machine. This is called a wire EDM machine. So here is a cast iron pot coming in. And the wire EDM machine actually uses electricity. You see little sparks that are flying there. It's got a very fine brass wire. And it uses the sparks to actually cut the metal. And there you go. So, in fact, we wind up having 2 halves of the most interesting kitchen in the world. Stuff doesn't work so good after you cut it in half, but this pot down here shows one of the ways we do things with liquid in it. When you cut a pot in 2, the great thing is you get 2 halves. So one half you glue Pyrex glass to. The other side you photograph so you can get the edges, because it's got the nice clean edges, then you sort of substitute it in. It's a little bit like in Hollywood when someone flies through the air on a wire, and then they digitally take the wire out. Now, turns out you can cut cut meat this way too, different set of machines. But we went to a lot of effort to explain how meat, how plants function, and how the function of those things actually drives how you'd cook them. An interesting thing here, there's a pork leg. We saw the lung, here's the leg. It's not so interesting, but a lot of people think of there being parts of an animal that are dark meat and parts that are light meat. In fact, it has to do with the ratio of two different types of muscle fibers. And in fact, as you can see here, the muscle fibers that are darker, those have more endurance. Because they need endurance, they need to store oxygen, so they have myoglobin, which is like hemoglobin in them. And they tend to concentrate near the bone. So it's not that there's parts of the pig that are light and dark, there's gradients inside the pig. This is what makes a muscle. And believe it or not, it's important to know how muscles are made if you want to understand how meat becomes tender and juicy and so forth, or the opposite, dry and tough. So this is one of our muscle illustrations. This is we decided if we were cutting everything in half, we might as well cut the earth in half. Not the whole earth, but come on, you can do it. Well, okay, well now we're all the way at the end. So each of these different things that we've talked about is a different window on a view of life. And one of the things that I find interesting about my job and my passions like this are in fact that they are so disparate. But it's by looking at the disparate views that I'm able to find connections that I don't think I would find any other way. You know, it's having the physicist and the brain surgeon at the same time. It's being able to look at something like an epidemic and say, hey, as an epidemic is something that's really bad, but if we can model it in...
Fighter plane.
Okay. You know, if we can model it really, really well, then maybe we will have a way that we can beat it. Now, I've given just a few examples of some of the more photogenic things. You know, in the case of epidemics, one of the things that I've been asked a number of times, well, what could you do about it? Is there some way you actually could stop a pandemic? So we decided to have a series of invention sessions to say, okay, how could you stop a pandemic? Is there anything you could do? Well, the first thing you say is, okay, so what kind of pandemic is this? Is this some kind of flu? Well, that's one possibility. And the interesting thing about that is we know a lot about flu, but what if it was something new like SARS? Because there are brand new pathogens. In fact, we'll hear more about those, I think, in one of the next speakers. Well, we got a bunch of people together and we came up with a plan. Now, it's kind of ambitious and kind of crazy to come up with a pandemic response plan, but in fact, there's a whole bunch of things you can do both medically and policy-wise and research-wise to be prepared for a pandemic. So one of those things is being able to figure out what the hell's going on quickly. How do you get new cases to come in? One of our crazier ideas is to offer a kind of a lottery for people that bring in new versions. Right? In fact, you could come and spit on this plate and you could win a prize. It's by using all of these different multimodal things that maybe we'll come up with an idea for a pandemic. Now, we also may not. I don't want to oversell this and say, oh, we know how to solve every problem. It's engaging with the problems, though, that gives you the real power. And that's true in the weird kinds of cooking as much as it is in these more serious medical things. You know, this new wave of cooking, a lot of the book is dedicated to the trend in cooking that's been going for about the last 20 years of science-inspired cooking, things like sous vide cooking, where you cook stuff at very low temperature for a long period of time. We have a whole chapter on organ meats, but unlike the guys from Toronto keeping them alive, we tend to slow cook them. Cooking with liquid nitrogen, cooking with unusual gels. And a lot of people say, well, why on earth would you want to do that? And part of it is because exploring new frontiers is intrinsically interesting. Coming up with food that there's no other way to make. Coming up with a book that explains food in a way, maybe, that no other book has done. Maybe good for good or for bad. So anyway, that's all I have. Thank you.